there's no silver bullet in housing.
But the urgency of housing availability and affordability have driven many states to do things that only locals used to do. Plus, if you're thinking biotech, you may not be thinking of this Commonwealth town. That's changing. All of that coming up.
TFIC takes you deeper into the stories that are shaping the future of state and local government.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart, I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From governing and government technology, this is The Future in Context. With Paul Taylor, I'm Ashley Silver. This is a special cover story episode of the podcast. We'll talk about Roanoke's transformation from a railroad town to a biotech hub. Plus, a look at an important shift in housing policy, where states are taking the lead in an area that has traditionally been left to localities. If you're going to have cover stories, it is always handy to have a magazine. And after a long absence, Governing has one again. Paul caught up with Governing senior writer Jared Bray and editor Alan Greenblatt.
Alan, this is a bit of a celebratory moment, but we have to be careful not to bury our lead. We've put the magazine back in Governing magazine.
Yeah, that's right. We've produced a print magazine for the first time in 5 years. We've been web only, but now we have an actual physical delivered to you through the U.S. mail magazine with, I believe, lots of good stuff in it.
I want to talk about that good stuff in a moment, but let's spend just another second about the magazine. Why does the return to print matter?
There's still, even in this day and age, of value to have almost like an operating manual on your desk. We're trying to reach an audience of pretty high-level government officials, governors, mayors, state legislators, top administrators. And our idea is basically to look at some of the biggest issues that they face, collectively, and try to write about the places that are doing the most innovative things so that they can come up with ideas that they can use themselves in their own jurisdictions. And we know from reading on the web, we all do it. I assume everyone in this audience does it. Often it's just a big blur, a big fire hose of information. And you can't always remember, where did I see that? And we're hoping, some of these stories of the magazine are a little bit longer. We hope a little more thoughtful, a little more in depth, and that it'll be useful to have it sitting on the desk for a while and say, oh yeah, this reminds me, I just read an article about this in Governing, and this is something we should be doing, or this is something your agency should consider doing because we've looked at it ourselves.
An example of that graces the cover. What put Roanoke, Virginia there?
So Roanoke is a relatively small city in Virginia, about 100,000 people, and they had a big problem. About a decade or so ago, they had 2 Fortune 500 companies close up their headquarters and leave. And we know lots of places have had this experience. They've lost a big headquarters, they've lost a big manufacturing plant, whatever their major employer might be. And often they spend years or even decades trying to reinvent what they've just lost. But, usually there's a reason those companies have left. So Roanoke decided to zag. Their major employer had been Norfolk Southern, a big railroad, and they went all in on biotech. And obviously a lot of places are trying to start biotech, but they had enough of roots in that field in the community. There's a decent-sized hospital system, medium-sized hospital system called Carilion Clinic that's right there, headquartered there. And Virginia Tech had just built a medical school in Roanoke, even though it's based about an hour away in Blacksburg. So between those two institutions created a big, what is now a big research institute on biotech. It went from 1 employee to more than 500. And it's just now at the stage where they're throwing off startups and private companies are starting. And, the different actors in the community are all working on this. The city, the community college, obviously the medical school and Carilion Clinic. And they really have an impressive biotech amount of biotech activity for a city of that size.
Roanoke shares the cover with a story about changing roles in the housing market, where states are doing what locals used to.
Housing has become a major concern in every state, really. It's no longer a coastal problem or a big city problem. Rural areas, suburban areas, everybody seems to be short on housing, and everyone is trying to figure out what to do. What this story is looking at is the idea that housing has been primarily a local government concern, but now state policymakers are very much in the game looking for ways to increase the supply of housing. What the story tries to get into is, it's easier said than done, as with essentially everything. States that were ambitious and sought essentially mandates and sought to demand that local governments allow more housing to be built, for instance, near transit. That heavy-handed approach hasn't gone so well, so states now are doing more carrot type things and trying to improve the situation, find incentives, find permissions for local governments to increase housing supply in their areas.
Jared, let's bring you into the conversation. Your piece in the spring issue of Governing magazine is titled Housing Starts. And in those two words, it identifies the two things that there's just too little of. Is it a fair reading of your piece to say that states now involved in what has typically been a local government matter are really headed off in all directions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's definitely some themes, but the overall trend that I think that a lot of people are identifying and taking interest in is that state governments have decided that housing, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of quality, low cost housing, is an issue that's big enough and widespread enough that it requires state attention. For a long time, it was cities had to provide housing for people of all different income strata, and felt that it was like sort of a main local duty. Smaller communities felt like they had to sort of either protect their existing housing or make room for new folks, but states didn't really have a role outside of like administering low income housing tax credits that came from the federal government or a couple other policies. But now, yeah, you're absolutely right. They're going in different directions. But a lot of what they're doing is taking a look at the state's role in zoning policy. Zoning policy was a local concern for a long time, still is in most cases, but states are sort of identifying local zoning controls as a factor that's increasing the cost of housing and constricting the supply of housing to a degree that's causing problems outside of the communities that are imposing those policies.
Let's talk about the West Coast states. Oregon started something that both Washington and California have glommed onto, and that's a statewide law permitting multi-use buildings on single-family or in single-family areas. What are we seeing in terms of effects of that?
The effects are still fairly small, I think, in most of those cases. I mean, a lot of the types of laws that they changed were really changing the rules in areas that are built out, like a traditional suburb that you can picture, sort of one house per lot kind of situation, maybe a driveway and a backyard, and a house on a fairly large lot. And so they're changing the rules in those places to allow developers to build maybe 2 units or maybe 3 or 4 in some cases, which theoretically could add a lot of sort of gentle density, I think is the term that people use, low grade density in small communities across the state. But the demand to actually do that kind of building and to for people to live in those types of houses still hasn't really caught up with the sort of policy changes. So they've changed the rules to permit more of that type of housing, but haven't seen a huge amount of demand or uptick in that type of housing yet.
On the East Coast, there's a couple of interesting examples. It goes back to 2022, but Pennsylvania's got something called the whole home repairs policy or framework. What's that about?
Yeah, it's an interesting bill, and in fact, U.S. Senator, I think John Fetterman, I'll have to fact check that, but just introduced the sort of national version of that. But to tell you a little bit about the state version of it, it's basically a state funding program that gives grants directly to homeowners to help them make the repairs that they need to stay in their homes. A lot of things we talk about when we're trying to figure out how to solve affordable housing is housing costs too much, or there's a demand from wealthier people on highly desirable units in posh downtown neighborhoods. But a lot of the problem in rural areas and suburban areas is that the housing is almost decrepit. Like there's places in the U.S. that have probably enough housing for the people that live there, but it's in bad shape. And so people are sort of like forced to the brink of having to sort of figure out somewhere else to live because they can't afford to keep up with the repairs. And so the sort of theory behind this law is if you give people these grants that are maybe, $10, $20, $30, $50,000, I think $50,000 is the max, to fix their leaking roofs or the plumbing or whatever it is, weatherize the home a little bit, it helps people stay in their homes without a huge outlay of funding to build new.
Rhode Island has got an interesting thing that it's pursuing, and it's got a county in Maryland and New York looking over its shoulder at this, but a public developer model. What's going on there?
But essentially what's happening in Montgomery County is that they're building mixed income housing. So it's not straight up public housing where, it's only available to the poorest people, but it's housing that is theoretically meant to be, I think, solvent but not profitable. So you can have people living in this housing that are middle income people, and they reserve a certain amount for lower income people too. People at different ends of the income spectrum. And the theory there is that if you sort of decouple the business of building housing from the sort of imperative to get as much profit out of it as you can, the margins change a little bit, and you can do more of the type of affordable housing that the private market just doesn't provide. So yeah, you're right. Rhode Island has a commission looking into what that might mean, and there was a bill introduced recently in the New York State legislature that would create a public developer for New York too.
You write at one point, restrictive housing policies are associated with higher costs, but perversely, it is less clear that zoning changes are associated with lower costs. I want you to unpack that a little bit, but it reminded me of that old housing advocate from New York City who became a failed politician or political candidate. Jimmy McMillan, his name, and he became internet famous for saying, the rent is too damn high. Why is the rent too damn high? And why is that perverse situation going on with housing policies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was absolutely spot on that the rent is too damn high. And there's like 100 reasons for that. Some of them are related to zoning policy and things like that. A lot of them are related to just the sort of market dynamics of housing. What's happening with the zoning stuff is, that line that you mentioned is, I'm sort of reading some research, I think it was from the Urban Institute, but a lot of other people are looking at this too. This is sort of a big hot topic. It's like, what are the actual impacts of changing zoning laws? And so people have been able to sort of find that these restrictive zoning rules that limit the amount of housing you can have to one house per lot in a given area are associated with higher costs. Those laws go back decades, and so you can sort of see the sort of compounding effect of those laws over time. What they haven't been able to find yet is that changing those laws, easing up the types of housing that can be built in it, is a quick fix for bringing those prices down. I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about with the single family zoning laws in Oregon and Washington and California, is that the laws have been changed, but the market hasn't necessarily transformed itself accordingly so far. So the researchers have found that exclusionary zoning does in fact associate with higher costs. Zoning reform does not necessarily equate with lower costs, at least not yet.
Another bit of zoning reform that's interesting is what Montana has been pursuing. You write about what they're doing in terms of requiring cities to allow duplexes and ADUs in single-family areas. And tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar dynamic to, well, it's not a similar dynamic. It's a similar policy sort of proposal to what's happening in California and other places. The really interesting thing about Montana, and there's some other sort of red state, Republican-led states that are working on housing reform stuff too, but they're saying we don't want to become like California. The housing costs in California have become so wildly out of control that people are leaving en masse, and the homelessness problem is growing. So they're saying we don't want to become like that, so we're going to try to get ahead of the game by changing these sort of housing policies now. There's a sort of irony in the fact that they're, by wanting to be unlike California, they're also taking a lot of the policies that California sort of Democratic legislators are sort of pushing forward to address the same problems. But I think a lot of people are sort of across the spectrum sort of aligned on how to address housing supply, because there are existing state laws in place that constrict those things, And so it's one of those things where it feels like fair game for government to address restrictions that it has on the books, whether you're left, right, or center.
One of the people that is in that camp is a governor that you spoke to in Colorado, and he's exactly in that space with seeing his state on the bubble, with California behind and Montana perhaps shining the way forward.
Yeah, I spoke briefly with Governor Jared Polis in New York, who's a Democrat, but he tried to do this last year. He had a big push. So did Kathy Hochul in New York. Tried to do a big push that would essentially supersede a lot of local control in Colorado cities by saying, you can't have zoning policies that exclude housing to a certain degree. You got to be able to allow X amount of housing in your boundaries. And it was a big sort of push to undo a lot of local controls that have been sort of perceived as raising costs statewide. It didn't pass, partially because the politics of it are so difficult that, local legislators don't like that kind of thing. A lot of times they're saying, this is the only prerogative we really have, is to sort of control land use within our boundaries. And so they don't want the states to sort of overstep on that front. He didn't get to do the big bill last year. What was interesting talking to him was him saying they're gonna try again with some various types of policies, maybe a little more carrot than stick, but also breaking up the sort of package of bills so that you could have little parts of a sort of broader set of housing reforms pass individually, and they can sort of attract different political coalitions around each policy.
So much more enthusiasm this year to do something on housing costs, which has risen to be the number one issue in our state. And then breaking out the concepts into 7 or 8 different bills allows for distinct but overlapping coalitions to help get each of those across the finish line.
As much local pushback as he received, he really mapped out a broad coalition of interest groups that have got a stake in the housing game, and some of them aren't what you'd expect.
Especially with increased interest rates, housing is even more of a crisis in our state. The costs are very challenging for families, whether they experience it as rent or mortgage. The business community, labor, education, all at the table, really driving the need for these policies. So teacher and law enforcement have a place to live, where businesses have a place where workers can live close to jobs, where union members can buy a home. So it's very, very broad coalition. Environmental organizations who also know the importance of growing in a way where people live close to job centers instead of having 1-hour commutes on crowded highways leading to worse air quality.
The dynamics, the politics of housing are a little bit fluid, in the sense that you have what you would traditionally think of as sort of left-leaning Democrats who are concerned with providing sort of housing for low-income people. You have right-leaning folks who see zoning policies as a sort of type of government overreach. And then you have sort of chambers of commerce and groups like that see sort of providing housing for everybody as a sort of baseline need for the economy to grow. There's all types of sort of appeals to doing something about housing. I don't think anyone's cracked the code exactly just yet, but a lot of people are giving it a go.
Well, it's really about removing barriers and costs to housing in every way possible, from reforming our construction defects liability to allowing more multifamily and transit-oriented development, to embracing property rights and allowing homeowners to build accessory dwelling units. So it's really, there's no silver bullet in housing. But what we want to fundamentally do is make it easier to build more housing that meets the need, especially lower cost housing in our state.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking to him about really the downside of being a magnet community, where everybody wants in, but nobody can afford to stay.
In areas that have had this great appreciation in home prices, these are areas that people fundamentally want to live. But the challenge is, how do we make it more affordable for our residents, and how can we create more housing closer to job centers that people can actually afford to rent or buy?
And so you have these places that are where the people who make the sort of service industry run can't live anywhere near the town itself because the prices are out of control.
There were 2 things in that interview with him that I thought were interesting, and they're not the things that come first to mind when you think about housing. One is reducing turnaround time. Maybe that's more obvious.
We are succeeding in meeting our metrics of reducing turnaround time. So we will, and we will hit the 90-day turnaround time by June. We're already at about 100 days, down from close to 200, 250. So what that means is projects for affordable housing and that have state financing can move along quicker now. Because the state is turning it around quicker.
And the second, which maybe isn't as obvious, is the advantages, at least from a zoning perspective and catalyzing housing development, is eliminating mandatory parking.
By eliminating mandatory parking requirements, that can save between $20,000 and $40,000 per unit. And while some home buyers want parking and they can have as much parking as they want, other home buyers might only want one parking space instead of two. So why pay for a parking spot you're not using?
Yeah, I mean, on the first point, I think that you're right that there's a certain obviousness there because time is money and so forth. But that's sort of the currency of the way developers talk about this stuff. Is the longer it takes government to approve housing, the more costly it is for them to build it. So cutting down on those timelines, I think, is something a lot of state leaders want to do. When it comes to parking, I mean, there's been a fascinating nationwide sort of movement over the last, well, I don't know how long back you want to trace it, but there's been people that have been sort of ringing this bell for a long time that mandatory parking minimums inflate the cost of housing by some absurd degree, because to actually build the sort of physical parking space into each housing unit, which is what a lot of codes require, is that for each unit of housing has to have at least one parking space, so you're not overloading the public streets with stored cars. It makes it so much more expensive to build, and it also induces demand for driving because everybody who has a garage is going to probably have a car and things like that. And so a lot of people are saying, like, if we just don't require developers to put a parking spot in every house, you could have lower cost housing. You could also potentially have people that don't have cars or have fewer cars and don't use the car for every single one of their trips to the store, to work, whatever, and things like that. I don't think anyone's delusional enough to believe that cars are going to disappear from the United States, but that the total amount of car usage we're doing right now, it is to a certain degree a function of these policies we've created, and peeling some of them back could help the problem somewhat.
Regular listeners to the podcast will recognize you from Your Mileage May Vary, our subseries on transportation and microtransit and all those good things. Where does proximity to transit fit in these plans? They seem to show up in at least 3 states that you talked about.
Yeah, very much so. I think a lot of the most progressive lawmakers that are working on housing policy have recognized for a long time that you can do denser housing near places that have good access to transit because you have a likelier, the population is likely to have fewer cars. It's not going to work everywhere because a lot of places don't have good access to transit at all. But to the extent that there are cities that have, really powerful transit networks like San Francisco, and I think you mentioned sort of Massachusetts, like Boston, all these transit systems are beleaguered in their own ways, but as a basic proposition, they're widespread and they're fast moving and they can move a lot of people very efficiently from place to place. And so if you build dense housing near the places where people can connect to those things, you can just get much more bang for your buck.
Very interesting stuff. It's under the headline Housing Starts in the spring issue of the new and rebooted Governing magazine, and we'll have a link to your piece at tfic.tech in the show notes. Thanks for doing this, Jared. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul. Good to talk to you.
Alan, the last word belongs to you on this. What else awaits readers in the spring issue of Governing magazine?
Well, we have a lot of things that we hope people flipping through will find interesting. Some are shorter features on important issues. For instance, we have a piece on the increasing amount of turnover among school superintendents. I think we've all heard about teacher shortages, but superintendents are also leaving or being forced out. We have just some, I don't want to say quirky things, but things you might go, I didn't know that. One is about citizenship for American Indians. On June 2nd, it'll be the 100th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. Until 1924, Indians were not citizens of this country, except under special circumstances, despite the 14th Amendment guaranteeing birthright citizenship. So we look at that and how Indian rights have changed over the past century. We have a group of columnists in this issue who are looking at politics, who look at cities lobbying. One is about Kirk Watson, who's the mayor of Austin. He'd been the mayor about 25 years ago and is mayor again. And obviously Austin has grown tremendously in that time. How do you return to a job when the city itself has changed so dramatically? I think we have one of the best looks so far at how the clean energy credits under the Federal Inflation Reduction Act are playing out, where it's actually primarily red states that are benefiting from it, but there's over $100 billion at this point from private sector investment that has been directly spurred by the tax credits in that law.
Alan Greenblatt, editor of Governing, he and his freshly ink-stained hands. The debut of the rebooted Governing magazine is in the mail now. You can also find its contents at governing.com. Our editorial and production team includes Theo Douglas, Zoe Manzanetti, and Kaylee Tedrow. Our executive editor is Noel Nell. Our editors-in-chief are Dustin Heisler and Kathleen Robinette.
The Future in Context is now available on YouTube in addition to the usual spots: Spotify, Apple, Audible, and Odyssey. Our occasional series, Government A to Z, will cycle around again soon. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe on the podcast app of your choice today.
And that will do it for us this time around. Next time out, AI as policy advisor. Fascinating experiment. Join us then. For Ashley Silver, I'm Paul Taylor. Thanks for listening. Stay up to date with the show at tfic.tech.